It's a great pleasure. Honestly, it's a fantastic pleasure because I remember it seems an age ago, back in March, when Fred Hebert was last here to lecture on Afghanistan. And frankly, it's always a pleasure when you get up after a lecture to ask if there's any questions, and you suddenly see a forest of arms go up, because that's what happened when Fred lectured last year, some 6 months ago. He is, as I think many of you know, an archaeologist, and that strange but absolutely fantastic sacred occupation, an explorer. Has traced ancient trade routes over land and across the seas for more than 20 years. He's led excavations on Silk Road sites across Asia, from Egypt to Mongolia. He's excavated at a 4,000-year-old Silk Road city in Turkmenistan, which made headlines around the world. He's also conducted underwater projects, as we'll hear, in the Black Sea, and as far away again as in South America's highest lake, Lake Titicaca, in search of submerged settlements. He completed his doctoral thesis at Harvard in '92 and held the Robert H. Dyson Chair of Archaeology at this university, where he was also a curator from 1996 to 2003 before joining National Geographic. As National Geographic's Archaeology Fellow, he extends the enthusiasm for archaeology to the public in lectures, presentations, films, and museum exhibits. And to be honest, he always goes where life is difficult. So he was just telling me beforehand they're charging him to go to Libya and thinking about Greece as well. He also holds positions with the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Robert Ballard's Institute for Exploration, and amongst his honors, he's received the Chairman's Award from the National Geographic Committee for Research and Exploration in 1998. He began to investigate the ancient trade routes of the Black Sea while he was here at Penn in 1996, and soon found that the research also included the flooded coastline of the Black Sea. He worked with Robert Ballard, famously Bob Ballard, investigating this submerged coast, and this is the focus of this riddle, this lecture, The Quest for Noah's Flood. Fred Hebert.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for coming at this late hour in the evening. It's wonderful to be back here. I feel at home here with all of you. It's just great. It's true that I was here at the University of Pennsylvania for a wonderful almost 10 years of my life, and I really think it was a great inspiration for a young scholar and a career that's taken me to many corners of the earth. And it's always been in quest of trade routes, and I've been fascinated by that since I began in archaeology. I'll tell you a little bit about that because people always ask me about that, usually kids, so I figure I'll tell you guys, right? So unlike most archaeologists, I wasn't interested in archaeology when I was a kid. I grew up in Chicago and northern Michigan, and I became fascinated by art. I was really interested in art, and I was drawing. And by the time that I finished high school, I told my parents that I am not going to go to college. Now, I have kids in college now, and they would be shocked to hear that. But my parents were unlike us today, and they said, fine, go ahead. And they drove me to JFK, and I got on a plane to Paris to go work in an art studio as an apprentice. And I got to Paris when I was about 17 or 18 years old, and I found out that they don't take apprentices. So I was stuck in Paris back in the late 70s, no cell phones, no internet. I think, oh my God, would I do that to my kids? No, and but luckily they took me under their wing, and I went to work for some archaeologists. And I started drawing pottery, and I started drawing architecture of materials that were very ancient from Iran, and I loved it. It was great. And I ended up doing a good enough job, so they invited me back onto the dig. And I remember coming home sheepishly to my parents and said, guess what? I'm ready to go to college. And that's sort of how it all began. And I studied trade routes, and it was really great. I was actually in Turkmenistan when I had just come back. I was sitting in my kitchen, and I remember my wife, who's in the audience tonight, who said, listen, Fred, you have a phone call from Robert Ballard on your answering machine. Why don't you call him back? And I thought, Robert Ballard? The explorer who found the Titanic underwater? I said, why in the world would he call me? And so after I sort of got my affairs in order after being in the deserts of Turkmenistan, I called him up, and he said, Fred, are you interested in the Black Sea? And I said, well, of course. It's one end of the Silk Road. We have trade that goes from Greece all the way to Afghanistan to China and back, and they always went through the Black Sea. Of course, it's fantastic. He said, do you know why oceanographers are interested in the Black Sea? I said, I have no idea. He said, the bottom of the Black Sea has no oxygen, and if a ship sinks in the Black Sea, the potential is that it would be perfectly preserved. It's an unbelievable opportunity for an archaeologist to look at a Silk Road spot. So, of course, I had to tell my wife, Kate, I have a new project. And that took me to the Black Sea. And very soon after that, looking at the Black Sea, we began to understand that it had a deeper history and a deeper mystery that we're really here to talk about tonight, and that is the formation of the Black Sea almost 7,000 years ago, when it was a lake and then it flooded, and that flooding event may have influenced world history. And that not only led to an amazing research project that we did, it was a University of Pennsylvania project together with National Geographic, together with the Institute of Exploration of Bob Ballard. We had an amazing thing. We made a film called The Quest for Noah's Flood. And this talk tonight is really sort of the background behind that film, because now I work for National Geographic, and I can tell you the insider's story about it. So let's start out with a little clip from the film, just to give you a little bit of background.
These waters hold many secrets, and one of them is linked to an old story.
Sorry.
These waters hold many secrets, and one of them is linked to an old story. The story of a massive, catastrophic event that happened at the very dawn of human civilization. A story that was told and retold for countless generations before it was finally written down. Once upon a time, there was a great flood, and a man named Noah built an ark. If that story is true, chances are it happened here, in the dark, restless waters that once were a lake, and almost overnight became the Black Sea.
Terrific. That film, which came out almost a decade ago, became one of the classics of National Geographic. It's seen maybe 4 times a year until this day. It's a mystery to this day about this film and about the story behind it, and we're going to address that because it really deals with one of the core issues that we have in terms of biblical history, in terms of our own history, and that is the whole question of the reality of the deluge, of the great flood, which is recorded in the Bible. It's a great story. It was a surprise to us. I thought we were looking for trade routes, and in fact, as we were doing our research, we realized we had a much greater topic to deal with. It's fascinating, and it sent me on a new quest looking for submerged sites to see if we could actually prove what became clear as we were doing research in the Black Sea. So let's just back up a little bit and think about the story of Noah and the flood as we've seen it. It really actually begins in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, before the scientific revolution, people were very observant of their environment around, and they actually saw landscapes such as this in Northumbridge, which are alluvial till, which are covering fluvial deposits. These are water lane deposits. These are found all over Europe. It was, for many European scholars, clear evidence that the biblical flood was actually true, that there was a reality to it, because it was obvious in the geology, Northern Europe, Southern Europe. As far as people could tell, there was a worldwide deluge that fit perfectly with the ancient documents. It wasn't until the beginning of the scientific revolution when all of a sudden the principles of stratigraphy suggested that these deposits were far older than what the Bible had suggested, that people began to question whether this was actually the absolute truth, that there was a deluge on a worldwide basis. Nevertheless, there were stories from traditions all throughout the Near East that correlated in a way that is fascinating, that brings traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together in a way that is something special, that brings these stories of a giant flood together and maybe suggests that there is a common root to all of this. You know, our experience of looking at that is in multiple religions. The flood is described in the Quran from about 700 AD. It's an interesting version of Noah. Noah's revered in the Quran. Well illustrated in Persian miniatures. The flood is an important part of Islam. It's very interesting. It's a little different from the biblical version of the flood, but it's still Noah. It's still an ark. It's still a massive flooding. Of course, there are the Genesis stories that belong to the Judaic-Christian tradition, and this is where we get the clearest illustration, the clearest description of sort of a flood, perhaps not as massively worldwide as what our medieval world thought it was, but clearly there were some things to look for. There was a giant ark. There was a flooding that happened relatively quickly. There was a dove that flew into the air. These are stories that are repeated and reiterated in many versions of the original scriptures. It's fascinating to see that they coincide with some of the early Mesopotamian texts. There's a fascinating text from 1600 BC that talks about the Great Flood. Interestingly, happened which dates to about the same time as the Thera eruptions, when people are thinking about Atlantis. So we come to understand that the natural world and the theological or mythical world have some relationship with each other. That's very interesting. Recently, a text has been read by Israel Finkel from the British Museum, who suggested that in the Mesopotamian text, it's not a big, oblong, wooden ark, but it's a round coracle. And this is the way the ark was depicted at 1600 BC. So there are variations to this. A coracle of this type would be much more limited regionally, more down in the Persian Gulf area. So the idea is that perhaps the flooding isn't quite as massively diluvian as suggested by the medieval writers, but was more regionalized, but still had a certain aspect of reality. Of course, we have the Gilgamesh stories from the cuneiform texts, and these are really interesting. We have some of these texts here at the University of Pennsylvania Cuneiform Archives. It's really amazing to see the relationship of these texts, which far predate the biblical texts, and have the similarities in terms of the ark, in terms of the dove, in terms of the flooding. Perhaps in this case, the flooding is much quicker, maybe related to some of the Mesopotamian floods that happened in the Tigris-Euphrates. These texts are so important. They tell us the story. They give us the link between the cuneiform text and the biblical text, and even perhaps the Quranic text, that suggests that maybe there's a root beneath all of these stories that ties them together. Maybe there are some deeper stories that might have been part of oral tradition. Again, here at University of Pennsylvania, there's some fascinating archaeological evidence from 3500 BC, so going further back in time, from archaeological excavations of Sir Leonard Woolley. And I myself had the chance to go visit the basement of the museum, where there are little packages with mud from Ur that are labeled the Great Flood. It's just amazing what this museum has. It's fascinating. We keep going back further and further back in time, hoping to find an origin, sort of like, all right, so we have, one version of the flood, another version of the flood. Maybe we should go back even further. And that led us in the 1990s to the Black Sea, where we were searching for trade routes. And we heard about a geological study that documented a cataclysmic infilling of the Black Sea around 5120 BC, dated by radiocarbon dates on shells and cores from Ukrainian sites, from Turkish sites, from Bulgarian sites. It really came to be quite amazing that the Black Sea flooded from a geological point of view quite instantaneously. From an archaeological point of view, it's not so easy to say what geological instance means. Is it 100 years? Is it 1,000 years? Is it even 1 year, as some people have suggested? But it may be at the very origins of all these stories about massive flooding. It may be the link that ties all these stories together. Well, with that, we became fascinated in the Black Sea, looking at the potential for finding submerged settlements that may shed light onto an area of the world which may bear strongly on the flood and the diluvial processes. It would have been the largest infilling, cataclysmic infilling, that sedentary people of the Middle East had ever seen. Larger than the floods of Mesopotamia, larger than the flooding of the Persian Gulf. This really might be at the origin, but we don't know about it. We had to investigate it. It was suggested by the geologists Walter Pittman and William Ryan that the Bosphorus was closed and it burst forth because of the rising sea levels of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Mediterranean world, which was not, the Black Sea was not part of until it all of a sudden burst like a Band-Aid breaking off of the skin, and it just flooded the plain of the Black Sea. Some people have suggested 30 meters, some people have suggested 70 meters, some people have suggested as much as 150 meters of sea level change that happened very rapidly, which would have impacted greatly on anybody who was living around the Black Sea. It's this sort of cataclysmic event that we think would have been told and retold all around this area, and could have been at the very core of flood stories. The Black Sea is quite perfect for this because it's a very deep basin. The Bosphorus is down in the lower part of the screen, and you can see it's a small isthmus. And there's a very small little break in there, the Bosphorus, and it was closed. We know it was closed. Geological studies have been clear that that was closed, and in fact, that lower part of the Black Sea, the deepest part, which is quite deep, it's more than a mile deep in its deepest part, it was a freshwater lake. It had freshwater fish, it had freshwater mollusks, and the area around that dotted line that you can see was the old coastline. And we have cores from Ukrainian specialists and from Russian specialists, Bulgarian, as far back as the 1950s and the 1960s, that suggested that there was grass growing along that plain. 100 feet, 200 feet beneath the surface of the water today. It was written down in the scientific reports. It wasn't really, people hadn't understood what it meant that there were these flooded plains until we had the current geological evidence of Ryan and Pittman to suggest that it happened relatively rapidly. And that suggested that we're looking at a flooded plain that had been occupied. But we don't have any evidence of people who had lived around that. That's where we became fascinated if we could find real archaeological evidence of a massive flooding some 7,000 years ago. Now, when it flooded, it was a very strange thing. You know, there was an area around that would have been in shock for a long time environmentally. And then the upper waters were filled with Mediterranean water, salty. Today it's brackish, that would have had a lot of fish. You saw the fish. But underneath it sealed a layer of dark, oxygenless water that was basically an amazing environment. It was completely dead. You don't see any life. You don't see any fish. You don't see any plants down here. It's basically a dead zone. And without oxygen, that is an amazing area that if anything falls into that water, which is sealed by that wonderful layer of salty water on top with all the fish and everything like that, things wouldn't deteriorate. Well, that became very interesting for us as archaeologists. Those fish were the source for people coming to the Black Sea literally several thousand years after that rapid infilling. We have no archaeological evidence of occupation around the Black Sea until approximately 2,000 years after the infilling. Some 3,000 BC is our first settlement that we have. And then after that, very rapidly, it became an area where there was a lush environment around the Black Sea. There were fish. By the time of the Greeks, this is a map of Greek settlements. It was one of the breadbaskets of the Greek world. And the Black Sea world became very important to the classical world. It became very politically important for them to control this. And it became one of the great settlement areas of the ancient world. And we, in fact, call it a maritime civilization around the Black Sea. It's a very, very important area for trade going through and for settlements. But there's a problem with this part of the world, which has been existing for over 150 years, is that it's also a politically sensitive area today. Ever since the Battle of Sinope is the northern peninsula of what is today Turkey, right in the middle, the Russians in the 1870s came down and defeated the Turkish fleet, the Ottoman fleet, and all of a sudden you have a divide in the Black Sea politically. And that divide survived until the Soviet period, until the end of the Soviet period, and it has been very difficult to access the Black Sea, and we have almost no archaeological research there. So it became truly interesting for someone like me to go to a place that's impossible to go to. So we decided to go to Sinope, and this is the Sinope Peninsula, as it juts north into the Black Sea, a fantastic port site. It's actually a double port. There's a port on the east and a port on the west. Great place to look at. And we realized that there was no archaeological record for this area. We were a little surprised because Turkey has a very well-developed archaeological record and a very developed archaeological service that is investigated almost everywhere except for the Black Sea region. We thought, well, there are two options. Either there's no remains or they're there, but nobody's recorded them. This is a photograph from my very first trip to the Sinope Peninsula. And we were driving along, and we were thinking like, well, we have no written archaeological reports about this area. How are we going to investigate this? And we all of a sudden looked to our right, and there by the side of the road in a farmer's field are the rocks that the farmer had pulled out of his field. Yeah, major columns from a Roman building. It's turned out that there is archaeology everywhere around the Black Sea. And we found these amazing grave stela that suggested that the people who lived around the Black Sea after the flooding were very oriented towards seafaring, that we were truly looking at a seafaring society. We became more and more excited about this. So we decided in 1996 here at the University of Pennsylvania to begin a project called the Black Sea Trade Project, BSTP. And the way we were going to do this, starting from scratch, was to begin with systematic archaeological survey. So what that means is you get a bunch of graduate students, you line them up in the field, and you walk the fields, hay fields, corn fields, and as you walk along, you both collect and you chirp out. You say, sherd, rock, brick. And these things are recorded in a very systematic way. It's the way we do systematic archaeology on land. And we didn't have high expectations, having 0 archaeological reports prior to this. But boy, oh boy, every single field we went to, we hit archaeological remains. It turned out to be quite rich. In fact, the one thing that stopped us was that as we continued doing our systematic research through the spring into the summer, the corn crops grew up, and we couldn't do any more survey in the area because we couldn't see the ground. I mean, it was really an amazing area, and we began to think that we're really dealing with a maritime civilization around the Black Sea. Not only that, but there were certain areas right along the coast, such as this. This is right on the northern coast, I'll show you in a little bit, where we found earlier materials. And here we're looking at an archaeological site with stone tools. Now, this is very interesting because these stone tools date to the Mesolithic period, the time period before the cataclysmic flooding of the Black Sea. Well, I'm going to back up just a moment. When we were surveying this, we said, look at this, a site right on the coast. We said, it just shows that people are always living by the sea. But when we realized that this site probably dated before 5000 BC, all of a sudden, a different concept came up. We realized that's not the coastline. This is a highland site, and what's underwater, we're looking at an area that had been inhabited previously. And these are the evidence that we had. And this is the Sinope Peninsula. And honestly, after 5 years of surveying on all along the isthmus and all along the Sinope Peninsula, we had literally dozens and dozens of archaeological sites of all ages. Port sites from the Ottoman, the Roman, and the Greek, and the Iron Age, and the Bronze Age, and the Mesolithic period. All along this area. Our Mesolithic sites were here, right on the very edge. And this is what convinced us that we really needed to add a dimension to our survey that we hadn't thought could be done before. We wanted to go into the water and do systematic archaeological survey to see if we could find these sites. By this time, we realized that we were dealing with a landscape of biblical importance. So how do you do this? How do you take systematic land archaeology and basically walk into the water? Now, many of you may have heard of George Bass. George Bass is the father of underwater archaeology. He taught here for many years. He's an archaeologist first and then a diver second. And he really created the field of underwater archaeology. But for the longest time, it was done with divers, and it was really not very systematic. It was based on sponge divers or people finding things opportunistically. And we wanted to change that and see if we could replicate what we did on land underwater, because that's the only way that we're going to find the similar pattern. And we did this by getting on little Turkish fishing boats, right? And we got on the Turkish fishing boats and we said, okay, we're going to start surveying underwater. And this time I had to change my team. And you have to understand how archaeology on land works, right? You get a bunch of enthusiastic graduate students, you feed them, you give them an airplane ticket, and you let them have as much beer as they want, and they go walk those fields, right? You can't do that underwater. So what we have is a sonar. So we take that. Now this ended up being quite a big problem because that sonar looks a lot like a torpedo. And several times it was confiscated by the Turks as we tried to get in the country. And we said, no, we're archaeologists. Right, with a torpedo in the Black Sea, right? Well, we did manage to get it in. And we followed it around with a little remotely operated vehicle. Because you can't go in the water for hours and hours, no matter how much beer you put in the ROV, right? And but that little thing has a camera on it that follows the sonar around, and it's amazing. So we went down into the Black Sea. Here we are deploying the remotely operated vehicle, and it just goes into the water and disappears. So we're like, yikes, what happened to it, right? But it comes down, and it looks at the sonar targets, and it finds these amazing things on the bottom of the Black Sea. This is a shipwreck, right? This is in the shallow part of the Black Sea. This is not far from Sinop. It's a shipwreck. Here in the shallow part where the fish are swimming around, the wood is eroded away. It's eaten by the wood borers, by the microbes. So all you see is the cargo. Those are carrot-shaped amphora. I think I have another one. There you can see sort of a carrot-shaped amphora. Those are made in Sinop, right? It's sort of like they have a little label on them. It said made in Sinop. So we know that this was a ship that was going from Sinop somewhere. Didn't quite make it out. So we were finding stuff systematically on the bottom of the Black Sea. It was very cool. Well, it's not what we were looking at. We said, okay, we're really interested in going into the deeper water, right? Deeper water is where there's no wood borers, there's no mollusks, there's no microbes that will eat that stuff, and we have the potential of looking for the submerged landscapes. That's pretty cool. So we wrote a grant. This was the most unusual grant I've ever written. This was a grant from the NSF Foundation, National Science Foundation, for $0. But it included about a month of time on the United States' largest research vessel, the NOR. I don't know how much it costs. I think probably is a couple $1 million worth of fuel and time. I mean, there's like a crew of 50 people who run this thing, and we got to use it. Wow, was that cool. So that allowed us to do what we hadn't done before, which was go to where we really wanted to go, into deeper water. We had to build new ROVs. This is through Woods Hole, much bigger ones than we had before. And we had to get bigger cameras to go in. And this is a big ROV called, well, we call it Little Herc, but it's pretty big. And it needs a crane to go in the water. I mean, this is like a big production. And this is why we needed the USS Nor to deploy this thing, because we wanted to go where nobody had gone, into the deeper water, to see if we could investigate this landscape. We also went high def. We hadn't been high def before. It was really exciting to move from fuzz underwater to clarity underwater. And there you can see some of the fish swimming around. This is our cabin, and we're being followed by TV cameras, and we have radio expeditions from NPR following us. It's sort of like, wow, this is science in the spotlight, okay? So we're going and we're looking for this area, and we're still trying to do it systematically. So we picked 3 areas that we're going to look. There's the Sinop Peninsula in the middle, just for your orientation. And we did 3 areas where we're looking in shallow water, in a little bit deeper water, and then in deep water. And the way we do this systematically is something called mowing the lawn that we do. We go back and forth, towing the sonar, towing the ROVs back and forth, sort of replicating my graduate students walking the fields. You can just imagine. It was really kind of tedious. We're sitting there. The difference between a graduate student and a remotely operated vehicle is the vehicle doesn't sleep. It's there 24 hours. So we had to develop a routine where for 8 hours, we had one group of people watching the sonar. For 8 hours, we had another group, and then another group. It's sort of like a marriage between being in the Navy and doing archaeology. Like, wow, that's sort of breaking scientific barriers there. Anyway, there was an added benefit to doing sonar along the coast. Aside from just looking at the bottom for archaeological remains, it allowed us to make a map, a topographic map, of what was off the coast, the modern coast of the Black Sea. And I think you see something here which is quite fascinating. There is a landscape off of Sinop from the bottom of the screen here. This is basically the modern, it's just off the screen. And you see hilly flanks here and rivers. This is submerged under the water, right? And this is the ancient coastline. That's the landscape that we were looking for. Rivers, hillsides, coastline. It's pretty amazing to be able to visualize it. And why is that so important? Because when we do our archaeological research on land, now by this time by the time we got the sonar, the big sonar in there, we had done 5 seasons of survey on land. And by this time, you hardly needed to walk the cornfields. My guys could just sort of say, listen, we know where the archaeological sites are. We know how people live. You have the hills over here. And you have the coastline here and the valleys here, and all the settlements are right here. And that nice band of land that sort of isn't at the top of the hills, it isn't down in the valleys, that's where people lived. So that became our predictive model looking underwater. And that was really exciting. So we had some idea of where to look for a potential submerged settlement that might predate the flooding of the Black Sea. That's pretty cool. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what it looks like to do sonar research and ROV research underwater in the Black Sea. This is like 95% of the time. All right? You see anything? Anybody see anything? No, not really. See the little white things in the water? Do you want to know what we call it? Yeah. We call it sea snot. It's actually like degraded fish and stuff like that that are sort of falling to the bottom. We have to navigate that. Can you imagine watching that for 8 hours? That's like what we do most of the time. I remember calling on the satellite phone home, and they said, "How is it? It's great." I said, "Kate, it's like watching television 8 hours a day. It's like terrible." So I want to tell you about when we finally got a hit. And I show you a little clip from our film. Oh, no, I'm not. First, I'm going to show you this interesting thing. So this is the other, we had several types of sonar. We had regular sonar, we had side scan sonar, and this is regular sonar. And it shows some sort of divot here, maybe a riverbed or something like that. And then here is something that actually doesn't look like very much, but it certainly doesn't look like that bare bottom of the Black Sea. And it's rectangular. We didn't have any targets that were rectangular before. And just to know how interesting this was, we gave it a truly exciting name. This became known as Site 82. Yeah, so after going through 1 through 81, we finally went to Site 82, and it was really interesting when we looked at our sub-bottom profiler, which is another type of sonar. We cut through the bottom to look at the topography. Hey, Site 82 is located right on that sweet spot where, if it was on land, that's where people would live. So enthusiasm kind of got going there. It's pretty cool. Now here's an interesting video from our
10 tedious hours pass before archaeologist Fred Hebert spots the first signs of Site 82.
Bob? He's in the galley. Oh, he's in the top.
Wow. So that was the first time we saw Site 82. What is that? Wow, look at that. So we brought little Herc down to look at it. And first of all, you'll see some things that look like wood. And second of all, you'll see some things like stone. We have never seen anything like this before. This is on that submerged landscape. So I'm going to show you a little bit more of raw video in a moment. I'm going to show you from two spots. We'll start out up there at Dive 21, and then we'll go down here. So I want to show you a little bit about what this looks, because it's absolutely astonishing. So it starts out looking like normal. And, by the way, this doesn't have any sound. There's no sound underwater, right? But then we came across these rocks. I mean, days and days of seeing nothing, and all of a sudden we're finding things that look like rectangular and squared off blocks at the bottom of the Black Sea. There's wood around it. I'm going to show you a higher def image of that block in just a second. This really amazed us. We had a lot going on in terms of looking at that. Here's a little bit higher def. I mean, it is really a squared block on our submerged landscape. So we went in with Little Herc, and we had the engineers on board create a sampling tool, and we went down to an area here where we sampled some of the wood and some of the bottom sediments. Let me show you a little bit about that. Please don't get seasick, because that's usually what happens to us after watching 8 hours of this. Those are wooden objects that have boreholes in them. Yeah. So we actually went and sampled the wood, and we sampled some of the soil. And I have to tell you how this site works, okay? Let me show you a little bit about, we mapped the whole thing, and we sampled in that area. And you can see it's about 50 feet long. It's about 20 feet wide. Those blocks, and there were lots of these square blocks, they sat up off the bottom of the Black Sea and created kind of like a snow fence. So when we analyzed the wood ended up being relatively modern. But we analyzed the soil from in between the rocks. Now the rocks they're not datable in terms of radiocarbon or anything like that. But the soil actually had very high phosphates, just the way settlements on land do, suggesting that we are really at a settlement, or we're really at a land-type site underwater. Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Now, we needed to have some comparisons to this. Now, this may not be a beautiful picture to you, but to me it's gorgeous. It reminds me of my friend Mehmet Özdoğan's, he's a Turkish archaeologist, who was excavating a Mesolithic site near Istanbul in Turkey, and this is his site. He said, it looks just like my site. See, doesn't that look like a Mesolithic village house? It does to me, it does to Mehmet. This is how we reconstruct it. Probably a wooden structure with some stone foundation and this kind of construction called wattle and daub. So we think that's probably what it is. About the same dimensions, about 50 feet by 20 feet. So we're pretty excited about this. Unfortunately, so did the media. The media became very excited about this. We were inundated by little fishing boats. They came and swarmed around the USS Nor, and they said, did you really find Noah's house at the bottom of the Black Sea? Oh, holy mackerel, what are we going to... We were on the front page of all the newspapers in Turkey. It was like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? My boss from National Geographic helicoptered down onto the boat, and he said, okay, we're getting called in by the Minister of Culture of Turkey to explain what we found. So what we had to do is we had to leave the site and take the helicopter and fly into Ankara. And I left the boat, the archaeological direction, in the hands of my able graduate student, Jennifer Smith. And I said, look, you can't be at Site 82 anymore. You have to go out. So go into deep water, like just, And this boat, this ship, I should call it a ship, the Nor is still costing like $50,000 a day in terms of gas just to run. And I'm thinking like, okay, don't turn the sonars off. Just go out into deep water. Just don't go near Site 82. And we have to explain ourselves to the Minister of Culture. And all of a sudden, while we were in Ankara with Bob Ballard and Terry Garcia and myself waiting for the Minister of Culture, got a call from Jennifer from the boat saying, Fred, I think we found a telephone pole in deep water. Oh my. Guess what that is? That's the mast of a ship. That's the deck of the ship, because Jennifer is in deep water. She's in about 900 feet of water. She's well beneath the oxygenated zone. And guess what? It's one of those ships. It's really fantastic. It's the whole ship. Sitting there, we were able to radiocarbon date it. It's a Byzantine ship from about 500 AD. It's one of the great discoveries that's ever been made in the Black Sea. It's really fantastic. It's right up there with finding a potential settlement at the bottom of the Black Sea. So we had to come back with even bigger ROVs and more equipment and, even bigger ships. So this ROV had claws on it, so we could actually do some sampling down there. And so we're ready for another expedition, and this is 2003. So we go down with our new high-definition cameras, and we go, and guess what we find? And this is where we sort of stand with this project now. Our ship, which is 1,500 years old, we actually had to excavate a little bit of it. And the reason is because all those fish, the sea snot that comes down, it creates a sediment on the bottom. This is something that actually our models hadn't predicted. We thought we were going to go down with our ROVs and our high-definition cameras, and we were going to find a house at the bottom of the Black Sea. maybe knows how. I don't know, but actually what we have is sedimentation. And as the more we investigated this, the more we realized, hey, this is more of an archaeological question than what we had expected. So we have these sediments, and we're digging. We finally get down onto the deck where the amphora are, and we say, this is, the kind of sediments that we're dealing with, right? So we're still smitten with the idea of finding the biblical landscape of the flood. We're looking for a flooded landscape from 5000 BC. We want to investigate it. Here's one of the spots. These vessels are filled with honey from Sinope. I mean, it's a great story. It's another story that we're dealing with. But what we did, we decided to move from northern Turkey to the northern part of the Black Sea, where the landscape would be much larger and more extensive and more possible of finding remains of the Great Flood. That's really exciting for us. So we moved up there. But our first sonar indications, we realized that the blue and the green and the yellow are all later sediments on top of the early landscape. So our project basically sort of stopped in about 2005 or 2006. And we started developing some technology to see if we could actually figure out a way how to investigate under deep water and under bottom sediments. And this is basically where we stand right now. The mystery of that landscape off Sinope stays to this day. Is it actually a house at the bottom of the Black Sea? I had to go elsewhere. As the director said, I've worked in Lake Titicaca and I've worked in Lake Issyk-Kul. Just 2 weeks ago, I came back from Lake Issyk-Kul, and guess what I was doing there? I was developing a sonar that beams. This is the sonar. This is in Lake Titicaca. And that sonar beams not only through the water, it pings sound to the bottom and back up to the boat to tell us about what the bottom is, and it does it through sound waves. This particular sonar has the ability to ping through the bottom sediments and tell us about the density, what's underneath that. And this is something new, and I'm really excited about that. Like I said, I just came back 2 weeks ago from a lake where we think there are settlements under the water. And what we get are images like this. Now, this isn't going to be published on the pages of National Geographic, maybe in a contemporary art magazine, but this is actually the bottom of Lake Titicaca. The blue at the top is the water, and what we have here, that's the bottom sediments, and this is actually some vegetation. And what we have here is something that's not only underwater, but it's under the sediments. And we do this back and forth, and we come up with a plan, and this is probably a set of buildings that are not only underwater, but under the mud of Lake Titicaca, which gives us a tool for looking at the Black Sea. So each one of these are probably houses. Here's a close-up of one of them. As you can see, it actually gives us the dimensions of the house. And we would like to take this technology, and as I said, I just came back 2 weeks ago from the field. We have our first results back from a new sonar that's developed, and the idea is that we'll take it back to the Black Sea to see if we can resolve this mystery of the flooded landscape and whether we really have habitation along the Black Sea that was flooded some 7,000 years ago, 5,000 BC, and tell us more about the story of the Great Flooding and its potential relationship with the flood. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Do we have time? Okay.
Fred, quite honestly. Fred, can you tell us just a little bit more about Noah's house that you found? Was it one house? Was it a village, do you think? Did it have any? What was it like?
Well, you get what you see with underwater imaging, right? First of all, we're looking without touching. This is in about 300 feet of water, so 100 meters, 90 meters to be exact. And it's too deep for divers to go down. So we're looking at everything with sonar, with images. And you saw the film footage yourself. Nobody gets to see the raw film footage underwater. And hopefully everybody's still okay. You can't imagine how difficult it is looking at that 8 hours a day. But it's very hard to interpret that. So what we do know is that we have a series of unusual rocks that are in a linear pattern. And we can measure them and we can identify them. We can take close-up pictures of them, and they look as if they're in a rectilinear pattern. It's about 50 feet long. It's about 20 feet wide. It compares very closely to the types of Mesolithic and Neolithic settlements that are found inland from the Black Sea that would date to the time period prior to the cataclysmic infilling of the Black Sea. That's perhaps our best evidence, is the correlates between what's on land and underwater. Where we want to go from here is to actually, we now know that there's a lot of sedimentation on top of that. So we want to be able to investigate what's underneath those sediments. And I think our best bet is to do it through remote sensing and to do it through a sonar that can beam through. So that's where we stand right now. We're dying to know what the nature of occupation along the Black Sea was like before it flooded. It'll tell us a lot.
So there's a question, please.
Wait for the mic.
If you're looking for those ark, then why would you go into the deep water of what is supposedly once a lake? It's not going to be there. So why go there?
So
answer that.
yes, the question is, are we looking for the ark, or are we looking for the landscape that had been flooded, where people would have had to leave, and they would have remembered that? That's actually what we're looking at. We're actually not trying to find the tangible remains of an ark. We're actually trying to find the remains of the people who lived in a landscape that was flooded out, and they would remember that and tell that story to their children. That would become oral tradition, which would get passed. And it's such a powerful story. It's like Atlantis, right? It's like, can you imagine that we were living in this place and it got flooded out and we had to leave? And we think that those kind of stories become part of the oral traditions that were eventually codified in traditions around the Middle East. And there were other floods in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf that would reinforce this idea that there was once a great flood, which is probably at the very core of our traditions of flood stories in the Bible, in the Quran, in Judaic tradition. It's very powerful.
That gentleman there.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, how long do you think the flood went on from the time the dam broke? And two, how heavily populated do you think the flooded area was?
The questions are both excellent and both unanswered. First of all, how long did the infilling of the Black Sea, the flooding, the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea area from lake to saltwater sea take? It almost depends who you ask. You ask a geologist who thinks in hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and they say, oh, of course it was instantaneous. Right? You ask an archaeologist and they say, well, maybe it was, an increase that their land was taken over, several feet every couple of months or something like that. They were kind of pushed off, sort of like, oh, we're not going to be able to farm there this year because it's underwater. I don't think anybody was cataclysmically there was no tidal wave that came out. Although our geologists suggest that in the area of the Bosphorus, the flooding would have been at the level of Niagara Falls, about 10 times flooding horizontally. It would have been really massive. In fact, so much so that the geologists think that it would have created a thunderous roar that could be heard for hundreds of miles. So there was some areas, and Bill Ryan thinks that perhaps at the shortest amount the Black Sea filled in 1 year, which would be a heck of a flood. Other speculations are that it was 100 years. In any event, it would have drastically changed the landscape, and there would have been an environmental shock between a freshwater lake and a saltwater sea that would have affected the environment, that would have strongly affected the populations in the area. Oh, there was the second question. And we don't know how many people were around. That's what
waiting
we're
for
trying to
Tina.
find out. for
Fred,
the second
assuming that you get this new sonar,
Yeah.
and assuming that you go down, and assuming that you find something amazing, do you see sending divers down at some point to really see what's there and excavate?
graduates. Yeah, it's. We certainly have divers who are interested. I must say, I myself in love with technology. I love the idea that we can actually, it's dangerous to go do deep diving. It's very opportunistic. If we can do with high technology, with sonar, with high definition cameras, with robotics that can excavate and do it systematically, I think we have an opportunity to advance underwater archaeology and advance our understanding of submerged landscapes all over. And by the way, that's not just in the Black Sea. We have flooded coastlines along North America that would tell us a lot about the early populations of the New World. I mean, there's so many places where we could apply this high technology to that would be just, change our understanding of our past. So it's something to pursue. As off, yeah. It is today. Yeah, it is today. Yeah, as you can see, it's sort of a submerged delta of one of the large Eurasian rivers, the Don. It's coming down. And the time when it was a lake, you realize that all the rivers flowed into the Black Sea Lake at that time. Those deltas would have been really rich. And, I mean, they would have been fantastic places for people to live. They would have had wildlife. They would have had lots of waterfowl. It would have been a really great place for people to. People tend to live near bodies of water, especially nice freshwater bodies of water. So you see what's called the Sea of Azov, but just imagine if the water was lower, and it would have been a beautiful delta, sort of like the Nile Delta. Imagine that. That's what we're looking for.
It's a great pleasure. Honestly, it's a fantastic pleasure because I remember, it seems an age ago, back in March, when Fred Hebert was last here to lecture on Afghanistan. And frankly, it's always a pleasure when you get up after a lecture to ask if there's any questions, and you suddenly see a forest of arms go up, because that's what happened when Fred lectured last here some 6 months ago. He is, as I think many of you know, an archaeologist, and that strange but absolutely fantastic sacred occupation, an explorer. Has traced ancient trade routes over land and across the seas for more than 20 years. He's led excavations on Silk Road sites across Asia, from Egypt to Mongolia. He's excavated at a 4,000-year-old Silk Road city in Turkmenistan, which made headlines around the world. He's also conducted underwater projects, as we'll hear, in the Black Sea, and as far away again as in South America's highest lake, Lake Titicaca, in search of submerged settlements. He completed his doctoral thesis at Harvard in '92 and held the Robert H. Dyson Chair of Archaeology at this university, where he was also a curator from 1996 to 2003, before joining.
True that I was here at the University of Pennsylvania for a wonderful almost 10 years of my life, and I really think it was a great inspiration for a young scholar and a career that's taken me to many corners of the earth. And it's always been in quest of trade routes, and I've been fascinated by that since I began in archaeology. I'll tell you a little bit about that because people always ask me about that, usually kids, so I figure I'll tell you guys, right? So I, unlike most archaeologists, I wasn't interested in archaeology when I was a kid. I grew up in Chicago and northern Michigan, and I became fascinated by art. I was really interested in art, and I was drawing. And by the time that I finished high school, I told my parents that I am not going to go to college. Now, I have kids in college now, and they would be shocked to hear that. But my parents were unlike us today, and they said, fine, go ahead. And they drove me to JFK, and I got on a plane to Paris to go work in an art studio as an apprentice. And I got to Paris when I was about 17 or 18 years old, and I found out that they don't take apprentices. So I was stuck in Paris back in the late 70s, no cell phones, no internet. I'd think, oh my God, would I do that to my kids? No, and but luckily they no oxygen. And if a ship sinks in the Black Sea, the potential is that it would be perfectly preserved. It's an unbelievable opportunity for an archaeologist to look at a Silk Road spot. So of course I had to tell my wife, Kate, I have a new project. And that took me to the Black Sea. And very soon after that, looking at the Black Sea, we began to understand that it had a deeper history and a deeper mystery that we're really here to talk about tonight. And that is the formation of the Black Sea almost 7,000 years ago, when it was a lake and then it flooded. And that flooding event may have influenced world history. And that not only led to an amazing research project that we did, it was a University of Pennsylvania project together with National Geographic, together with the Institute of Exploration of Bob Ballard. We had an amazing thing. We made a film called The Quest for Noah's Flood. And this talk tonight is really sort of the background behind that film, because now I work for National Geographic, and I can tell you the insider's story about it. So let's start out with a little clip from the film, just to give you a little bit of background.
These waters hold many secrets, and one of them is linked to an old story.
Sorry.
National Geographic. As National Geographic's Archaeology Fellow, he extends the enthusiasm for archaeology to the public in lectures, presentations, films, and museum exhibits. And to be honest, he always goes where life is difficult. So he was just telling me beforehand they're charging him to go to Libya and thinking about Greece as well. He also holds positions with the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Robert Ballard's Institute for Exploration, and amongst his honors, he's received the Chairman's Award from the National Geographic Committee for Research and Exploration in 1998. He began to investigate the ancient trade routes of the Black Sea while he was here at Penn in 1996, and soon found that the research also included the flooded coastline of the Black Sea. He worked with Robert Ballard, famously Bob Ballard, investigating this submerged coast, and this is the focus of this riddle, this lecture, The Quest for Noah's Flood. Fred Hebert.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for coming at this late hour in the evening. It's wonderful to be back here. I feel at home here with all of you. It's just great. They took me under their wing, and I went to work for some archaeologists. And I started drawing pottery, and I started drawing architecture of materials that were very ancient from Iran, and I loved it. It was great. And I ended up doing a good enough job, so they invited me back onto the dig. And I remember coming home sheepishly to my parents and said, guess what? I'm ready to go to college. And that's sort of how it all began. And I studied trade routes, and it was really great. I was actually in Turkmenistan when I had just come back. I was sitting in my kitchen, and I remember my wife, who's in the audience tonight, who said, listen, Fred, you have a phone call from Robert Ballard on your answering machine. Why don't you call him back? And I thought, Robert Ballard? The explorer who found the Titanic underwater? I said, why in the world would he call me? And so after I sort of got my affairs in order after being in the deserts of Turkmenistan, I called him up, and he said, Fred, are you interested in the Black Sea? And I said, well, of course. It's one end of the Silk Road. We have trade that goes from Greece all the way to Afghanistan to China and back, and they always went through the Black Sea. Of course, it's fantastic. He said, do you know why oceanographers are interested in the Black Sea? I said, I have no idea. He said, the bottom of the Black Sea has no